Treason is not the reason for the season. Episode 1, Summary. April 19, 1995, white supremacist and domestic terrorist, Timothy McVeigh detonated 5,000 pounds of explosives in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The bomb destroyed a third of the building and killed 168 people, including 19 children, and injured 684 others. To this day, it is one of the deadliest domestic terrorist attacks in U.S. history. McVeigh was captured an hour and a half later, wearing a T-shirt the front of which had an image of President Lincoln with a caption from his assassin, John Wilkes Booth, Sic semper tyrannis. Thus always to tyrants. On the back was a quote from Thomas Jefferson, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." Quoting Lincoln's assassin showed McVeigh's white supremacist beliefs. McVeigh was also carrying pages of the Turner Diaries, a fictional tale that portrays a white supremacist as a hero who starts a revolution by blowing up FBI headquarters. The quote from Thomas Jefferson showed McVeigh believed in the idea of militia-as-terrorism. McVeigh believed that the founders designed the Constitution and Bill of Rights to protect and enable private, anonymous, paramilitary groups to hoard unregistered weapons and train to overthrow the government whenever they saw fit. This belief in militia-as-terrorism is specifically what drove McVeigh to decide when to kill hundreds of innocent people, because McVeigh blew up the federal building on the 2-year anniversary of the fire that ended the siege at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. The Waco siege started in February of 1993 when the ATF tried serving search warrants for illegal weapons at the Branch Davidian compound near Waco. Gunfire erupted, and a standoff lasted 51 days. The FBI tear-gassed the entire compound to force the Branch Davidians out. Mark Brio, a former member of the Branch Davidians, described the group as a religious cult of madness and depravity. The Branch Davidians were expecting the apocalypse to come any moment, and saw the siege as proof it was the end times. The Branch Davidians started multiple fires in the compound, and the resulting inferno killed 76 people. After the raid, officials found 48 machine guns, as well as stockpiles of silencers, hand grenades, and other weapons. People in the compound had illegally modified semi-automatic weapons to become fully automatic. McVeigh blew up the federal building on the anniversary of the fire at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, because McVeigh felt the federal government had no authority to stop anonymous people from stockpiling unregistered machine guns, grenades, and silencers, not even a doomsday cult with a crazy leader. McVeigh was a full-blown militia-as-terrorism extremist, and murdered 168 people based on those beliefs. In 2002, FBI Assistant Director Dale Watson testified before the Senate, saying that since the 1990s, right-wing extremism had become the most dangerous domestic terrorist threat to the country. He also testified that domestic right-wing terrorist groups often adhere to the principles of racial supremacy. In 2021, FBI Director Christopher A. Wray testified before the Senate saying that domestic right-wing terrorism incidents had doubled in a year, that the number of investigations into white supremacists has tripled, and that domestic terrorism has been metastasizing around the country for a long time now. These domestic terrorists think they are doing what the Founding Fathers wanted. They think the Constitution and Bill of Rights support their view of anonymous access to unregistered weapons. They think the founders intended for militias to be private organizations, operating outside government control, anonymously stockpiling unregistered weapons, to overthrow the government. And one of their biggest motivations for overthrowing the government is they see the fight for racial equality as an evil that justifies destroying the government. McVeigh's attack occurred in the 1990s. But redefining what the founders meant by the word militia is going strong even today. So we want to see a militia, basically, re-established in this country and trained up. Oath Keepers President and Founder Stuart Rhodes, 2018. So, this is how the cycle goes. First, a tragedy occurs involving guns, a mass shooting perhaps, a kid with a gun, a former student goes into his old school and shoots anyone he can find, or someone who is clearly mentally disturbed buys a gun and shoots people where he was recently fired, or just rampant, senseless criminal violence with guns. Second, some folks point out that a mentally disturbed person maybe shouldn't have easy access to guns. Or that maybe it's just a tad too easy for criminals to get guns. Or that maybe a waiting period to buy a gun might help cool off hotter heads. Or that someone with a criminal history can easily buy a gun via a private sale and maybe that's not such a good idea. So, they suggest some sort of restriction to buy and possess a gun. Third, the militia-as-terrorism extremists crawl out from under their rocks, from out of their bunkers, from out of their basements, and argue that the founders said shall not be infringed, and therefore any restriction whatsoever is a violation of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the intent of the Founding Fathers. Fourth, because history classes generally are so boring as to put people to sleep, most people don't know this militia-as-terrorism idea is complete bilge bull, and eventually, they give up pushing for anything that might slow down the gun violence. Fifth, everyone forgets the entire thing until we go back to step 1, and another tragedy occurs. When it comes to talking about gun control in the United States, militia-as-terrorism extremists argue that the Founding Fathers wanted militias to be private, operating outside the government, anonymous, unregistered, no paper trail, designed to overthrow the government. Except that's not what the founders wanted at all. Private. If the Founding Fathers intended for militias to be private organizations operating outside government control, why did they put in the Constitution that the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the militia? This directly contradicts the idea that the founders intended for Billy Bob Hayseed to run amok with his own little private militia operating outside government control. Anonymous. If the Founding Fathers intended for militias to be anonymous, why did the first Congress pass the Militia Act of 1792, signed by President Washington, that made mandatory registration for militia service the law of the land? Registration was needed so that members could be trained by the state and so members could be called up/activated by the state by their Commander-in-Chief, the President. You can't train a militia if they're anonymous. You can't call up a militia if you don't know who they are. This mandatory registration directly contradicts the idea that the founders intended for Billy Bob Hayseed to run amok with his own little private militia operating anonymously, and without a paper trail, designed to overthrow the government. If the Founding Fathers intended for militias to overthrow the government, why did they specifically define that as treason in the Constitution? Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against the U.S. If the Founding Fathers intended for militias to commit insurrections, why did they pass the Militia Act of 1792, which said one of the reasons the President can activate the militia is to suppress insurrections? The Militia Act of 1792 didn't say militias were there to rise up in insurrection against the government, but specifically that militias could be called upon by the President to crush insurrections. If the founders intended for militias to overthrow the government, why did they put into the Second Amendment that militias were specifically for the security of the state? A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state. The Constitution defines overthrowing the government as treason. The Second Amendment says that a militia is required for the security of the state, not to overthrow it. The Militia Act of 1792 said one purpose of the militia was to fight anyone attempting to overthrow the government. These three national documents directly contradict the idea that the founders intended for Billy Bob Hayseed to run amok with his own little private, anonymous militia, hoarding unregistered weapons, to overthrow the government. To further show that the founders absolutely did not intend for militias to overthrow the government, we can look at how the founders reacted to two different rebellions against the U.S. government in their time. Daniel Shays led a rebellion of 1,500 men against the federal government. Many people at the time viewed it as an existential threat. Ben Franklin referred to Shays' rebellion as a dangerous insurrection. George Washington referred to Shays' rebellion as a cloud of evils. John Adams would call Shays' rebellion an act of terrorism. Sam Adams said that Daniel Shays should be quickly executed. Most of the founders were so terrified that Shays' rebellion might actually succeed that within months, the founders threw out the Articles of Confederation and ratified the Constitution which, among other things, defined armed rebellion like Shays to be treason, stated that militias serve under the Commander-in-Chief, the President, and created a much stronger federal government so that it would have the ability to crush rebellions like Shays. During Washington's presidency, the Whiskey Rebellion saw perhaps 1,000 men rise up in armed violence against the federal government for what they saw as unfair taxes. Washington activated a militia of 13,000 men, and as Commander-in-Chief, led them to Pennsylvania where he crushed the rebellion. Over and over again, when we look at what the Founding Fathers did collectively, the words they ratified in the Constitution, the words they ratified in the Bill of Rights, the language they put into the laws they passed in Congress, it is clear that the Founding Fathers did not intend for militias to be a way to encourage Billy Bob Hayseed to anonymously stockpile unregistered guns so that he and his anonymous cousins could rise up in rebellion against the U.S. government. The Founding Fathers were very clear. Privately armed individuals, operating anonymously to overthrow the government, like Shays' Rebellion, were evil, a dangerous insurrection, terrorism, and the very definition of treason. And the Founders redesigned our entire system of government to crush such rebellions, including defining in our Constitution, Bill of Rights, and laws, that militias are a government-controlled, government-commanded, government-regulated, government-registered, government-subservient army, operating under the Commander-in-Chief, the President, with the explicit mandate to defend the state and put down insurrections, not start them. And so, as the United States has one mass shooting tragedy after another, and the conversation inevitably turns to gun control, and the extremists try to rewrite history by saying nonsense like the Founders intended for militias to be private, anonymous, and designed to overthrow the government, in an attempt to oppose even the slightest and most sensible gun regulation, it needs to be pointed out that they are not talking about militias as the Founders intended, rather they are talking about treason exactly as the Founders defined it. Treason is not the reason for the Second Amendment. Treason is not the reason the Founders protected a right to bear arms. The Founders did not define the highest crime of treason in the Constitution, only to ratify the Second Amendment to encourage and enable people to commit treason. The Founders did not make the militia subservient to the government and under the command of the President in the Constitution, only to somehow imply in the Second Amendment that they really wanted militias to be a bunch of Billy Bob Hayseeds anonymously stockpiling unregistered weapons training to overthrow the government. The Constitution is not a suicide pact. It was not designed to protect anonymous terrorist groups and enable them to stockpile unregistered weapons to overthrow the government. The Founding Fathers never intended the Second Amendment to be some sort of self-destruct clause that would allow civilians to overthrow their own government. So when extremists keep using the word militia, just know that that word does not mean what these extremists think it means. When these extremists say militia, what they really mean is the sort of terrorism committed by Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion. When extremists say militia, they really mean the sort of acts of terrorism that Timothy McVeigh committed. McVeigh wrote the following to a friend: "Those who betray or subvert the Constitution are guilty of sedition and/or treason, are domestic enemies and should and will be punished accordingly." Timothy McVeigh. He saw the FBI going after the Branch Davidians for dozens of illegal weapons as the FBI violating the Constitution and felt the FBI was committing sedition/treason. But the Constitution states militias are subservient to the government, operate under the Commander-in-Chief, the President, and the Constitution states that levying war against the U.S., exactly what McVeigh did, was treason. The Second Amendment clearly states that militias are for the security of the state. And the Militia Act of 1792 required mandatory registration for militia service and stated the President can activate the militia to suppress insurrections, not start them. Militia-As-Terrorism Extremists fetishize the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, thinking these documents mean they get to overthrow the government whenever they disagree with anything it does. Every time you hear someone say what part of shall not be infringed do you not understand, to argue against any and all legal restrictions of guns, they have a fantasy version of what these documents actually say and what the Founders actually intended, and it has nothing to do with reality. They think they have a right to anonymously hoard unregistered machine guns, silencers, and grenades. Every time you hear some militia-as-terrorism extremist talk about how the founders wanted people to overthrow their own government, they are pushing a wish fulfillment fantasy where they have convinced themselves that the founders are the lurkers who support them in email. Based on the actions of the Founding Fathers and the nation as a whole when they ratified the Constitution and Bill of Rights, and based on the Militia Act of 1792, if the United States today wanted to hold true to the intentions the founders had with regard to militias, the U.S. federal government might create the Militia Selective Service Act of 20XX, MISA 20XX. The Selective Service System is a contingency mechanism for the possibility that conscription becomes necessary. MISA does not form militias, rather it has people register for selective service in case the government needs to form a militia in the future. In addition, MISA has people register their weapons for possible use in militia service as well. If a person is physically unable to serve in the militia, their weapon may still be used by the government to arm a state militia. Lastly, MISA describes the minimum weapon expected for militia service: a single long gun, either a .223 caliber rifle, or 20-gauge shotgun, mechanical reload action such as bolt action, lever action, or pump action, with a fixed internal magazine, of no more than 10 rounds, and no more than 20 rounds of ammunition. The Militia Act of 1792 required every able-bodied man register for militia service. And it required every militia member to possess a single musket, with an 18-gauge barrel, 24-shot, and a quarter pound of powder. MISA instead requires that everyone with a weapon register with Militia Selective Service for possible militia service. The U.S. has the highest number of guns per person of any nation in the world. The U.S. literally has more guns than people. Existing gun owners should provide a sufficient number of people and guns for possible militia service. Militia Act of 1792 put an economic burden on militia members by requiring them all to purchase a musket and ammunition. MISA 20XX significantly lightens the burden by not requiring anyone purchase a weapons, but rather requiring people who would own a firearm anyway to register for militia service, and register their firearm for service. MISA does not require anyone purchase a gun, but instead registers existing guns, which is a much smaller burden. The Militia Act of 1792 required able-bodied men to register, and stated that the militia shall be subject to the same laws and discipline as the full-time army. Currently, when someone enlists into the army, they are subjected to a criminal background check, mental health check, and so on. MISA 20XX would perform background checks on possible militia members similar to the checks that the full-time army is subject to today. Gun owners would be licensed. States that currently require licensing of gun owners and registration of guns have had their laws challenged before the Supreme Court, and repeatedly those laws have been upheld because the Supreme Court has said that such laws are the same in concept as the Militia Act of 1792. One important difference between the current state of gun regulations and MISA 20XX, is that currently, many states have no background check requirement for private sales of guns, and MISA would be federal law, and it would mandate universal background checks and registration for all firearms, no matter how they are purchased. And lastly, MISA would define a minimum weapon expected for militia service. The Militia Act of 1792 mandated militia members possess an 18-gauge musket, 24-shot, and a quarter pound of powder. MISA would establish that a minimum weapon expected for militia service would be a single long gun, either a .223 caliber rifle, or a 20-gauge shotgun. Either long gun would have a fixed internal magazine of no more than 10 rounds, and would use a manual mechanical action to reload, such as bolt action, lever action, or pump action. MISA would also mandate that the government would expect the militia member to possess no more than 20 rounds of appropriate ammunition for the above long gun. The reason that MISA establishes a minimum weapon expected for militia service has to do with how the Second Amendment works with states' rights. The Second Amendment mandates that all states must allow the arms expected for militia service. All other rights to arms and all other gun regulations are left to the states. The Militia Act of 1792 defined the arms required for militia service as a single musket and 24-shot. MISA defines the arms expected for militia service to be a single rifle or shotgun. States are then free to regulate all other guns as they see fit. When the Bill of Rights and Second Amendment was ratified, 5 state constitutions had no right to bear arms, 5 state constitutions had a right to bear arms for militia service only, and 2 state constitutions protected a right to bear arms for militia service and for personal self-defense. The Second Amendment took all these many different states with their varied approaches to arms and required all these states to allow arms for militia service. And the Militia Act of 1792 defined the arms expected for militia service to be 1 musket, 24 shot, and a quarter pound of powder. All other arms, all other rights to arms, were left to the states to decide. For 2 centuries, states have regulated arms not used for militia service. But with the Militia Act of 1792 having expired, the courts have expanded the definition of arms expected for militia service to be any long gun, up to 50 caliber, with no limit on the total number of guns or ammunition that any individual can stockpile. By again establishing the gun expected for militia service, states who wish to regulate non-militia weapons can do so. States that wish to restrict the number of weapons or ammunition a single person may possess may do so. The Militia Act of 1792 established a single musket and 24 shot as the arms expected for militia service. At that time, if a state wished to regulate all other weapons, it was state right to do so. MISA 20XX merely re-establishes the minimum weapons expected for militia service as a single long gun, fixed internal magazine of no more than 10 rounds, mechanical reload action, and no more than 20 rounds of ammunition total. All other arms and right to arms are left to the states. If a state wants to allow open carry and an entire armory of weapons, that's up to the state to decide. But if a state wants to only allow the arms required for militia service, that is also up to the state to decide. And MISA makes clear what arms are expected for militia service and what arms are protected by the Second Amendment. Whatever the states do, MISA requires all firearms and their owners be registered for possible militia service. As for MISA doing background checks and registration of all guns, no matter how they are purchased, this will first and foremost allow the government to quickly create a militia if a militia is needed. But as a side effect, universal background checks and registration of all guns will make it much more difficult for criminals to get guns, and could significantly reduce the gun homicide rate in the nation. Because states with license and registration requirements find that nearly 3/4 of all guns used in a crime come from states with weak gun laws. The flow of guns from states with lax gun laws to states with strict gun laws is called the iron pipeline. The iron pipeline, i.e. guns flowing from states with weak gun control laws, accounts for the vast majority, up to 3/4, of guns used in crimes. Militia-As-Terrorism Extremists try to argue that the existence of gun crime in Chicago, where the gun control laws are strict, proves that gun control doesn't work. But the borders to Chicago and the state of Illinois are completely porous. And if a criminal in Chicago wants a gun, they get in a car and in an afternoon they drive to one of the many states that don't require any paperwork for private sales. They pay cash. And then they drive back. Gun control laws work in Chicago. The problem is that criminals have cars and states with weak gun laws are just a drive away. 3/4 of all guns used in crimes come from states with weak gun laws. If a federal law required licensing of all gun owners and registration of all guns, then this would cut off easy access to 3/4 of guns that criminals currently get through the iron pipeline. And federal registration would be completely in line with the founders' vision of militia because the founders needed militia members to register with the state so they could be trained, and so they could be called up when needed by their commander-in-chief, the president. MA 20XX would be similar in spirit to MA 1792, but would benefit from computers allowing easy and instant background checks for all gun purchases, and computers allowing easy licensing of all gun owners, and easy registration of all guns to their owners. Once any regulation relating to guns is discussed, this is usually when Billy Bob Hayseed and his anonymous cousins crawl out from under their rocks and wail, "What part of shall not be infringed do you not understand?" A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Second Amendment. Billy Bob Hayseed is under the misguided, wish fulfillment, fantasy that the Second Amendment is trying to create a lawless, post-apocalyptic, dystopian future where Billy Bob Hayseed imagines he and his cousins are their own little warlords, having anonymously accumulated a stash of unregistered military weapons, with nary a scrap of paper to buy them. It's almost as if he never read the Constitution he claims to religiously worship. Congress shall have power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States. How can Congress call forth the militia unless the militia is registered in some manner? How can Congress organize, arm, and discipline the militia, and govern them without a whole bunch of laws, regulations, restrictions, and such to do all that? The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, and of the militia, U.S. Constitution. How can the President be Commander-in-Chief of the militia unless the militia is regulated, controlled, registered, trained, and constrained? The Founders did not spell out these powers of Congress and the President over militias in the Constitution only to have the Second Amendment say shall not be infringed to somehow magically renders all those powers null and void. The Bill of Rights was ratified into law in 1791. The next year, Congress passed the Militia Act of 1792, which required every able-bodied man register for militia service and acquire for themselves a laundry list of equipment including a musket, 24-shot, powder, bayonet, 2 spare flints, powder horn, knapsack, and so on. The Militia Act of 1792 heavily regulated the militia. In fact, it regulated the militia to be an extension of the full-time army. The Militia Act of 1792 states that the militia shall be organized by the states into divisions, brigades, regiments, battalions, and companies, that the brigade inspector shall introduce the system of military discipline to the militia, that the militia shall receive the same pay and allowances as the troops of the United States. The Militia Act of 1792 also states the militia shall be subject to the same rules and articles of war. The Militia Act of 1792 has several articles dedicated to dealing with how to court-martial, fine, and imprison militia members who fail to obey orders. The Second Amendment and its "shall not be infringed" phrase was ratified by the nation in 1791. The very next year, Congress passed the Militia Act of 1792, and nearly every word of that act would violate Billy Bob Hayseed's absolutists, magical, wish fulfillment, fantasy interpretation of what shall not be infringed does and does not mean. The Constitution, Second Amendment, and Militia Act of 1792 together make clear that the Founders' intentions for militias in these founding documents was to be a military draft of civilians into militia service. The Second Amendment starts out by making that abundantly clear. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The Second Amendment is not trying to create a right for Billy Bob Hayseed to anonymously hoard unregistered weapons, training to overthrow the government. The Second Amendment is designed to draft civilians into the militia, and have them bring their own weapons. And the other documents make clear, the militia is a supplement to the full-time army, organized by the state in the same fashion as the full-time army, receives the same pay, is subject to the same laws of war, can be subject to court-martial, fines, and imprisonment for failing to obey orders, and shall be trained in the system of military discipline. When the Second Amendment says "shall not be infringed," that phrase is said in the context of the Constitution and Militia Act of 1792 that make militias an extension of the full-time military, trained by the states, subservient to the President. Which means, by Billy Bob Hayseed's interpretation, there is a whole lot of infringement going on, and every bit of it was intended by the Founders. In short, the Second Amendment is not a right to live in a lawless dystopia, awash in unregistered guns, but rather it is a right to be drafted. George Washington said as much 5 years before the Second Amendment was written, when the U.S. was still operating under the Articles of Confederation. It may be laid down as a primary position, and the basis of our system, that every citizen who enjoys the protection of a free government, owes not only a proportion of his property, but even his personal services to the defense of it, and consequently that the citizens of America, with a few legal and official exceptions, from 18 to 50 years of age should be born on the militia rolls, provided with uniform arms, and so far accustomed to the use of them, that the total strength of the country might be called forth at a short notice on any very interesting emergency. George Washington, in letter to Hamilton, 1783. The Constitutional Convention was just 4 years later in 1787. The Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791. And the Militia Act of 1792 implemented this quote into law, with but a few minor differences. First of all, MA 1792 drafted men from 18 to 45, instead of 18 to 50. Second of all, by the time the Militia Act was passed, the U.S. was in severe economic stress because under the Articles the federal government had no power to collect taxes, and so was constantly broke. And so, while Washington's quote suggests militia members should be provided with arms, instead, the Militia Act of 1792 required members to purchase their own weapons, with the law specifying the size of barrel and how much ammunition to have on hand, and so on. The Second Amendment reserves this approach into the Bill of Rights. The right to bear arms was meant to reserve the right to draft civilians into the militia and that they buy their own weapons. When the Second Amendment says shall not be infringed, it is saying this within the context of militia service, in the context of the Constitution giving Congress the power to organize, arm, and discipline the militia, and govern them, in the context of the militia being subservient to the President. In the context of the every able-bodied man being drafted into militia service. In the context of the militia being organized like the full-time army, receiving the same pay, trained in the same discipline, subject to the same laws of war, and exposed to the threat of court-martial, fines, and imprisonment for disobeying orders. The founders did not see the Militia Act of 1792 as an infringement of the Second Amendment, but rather as a direct and obvious expression of its intent. The following videos will dive into the details of each point made here, showing the larger context of how the Articles of Confederation, Shays Rebellion, the U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, the Militia Act, and the Whiskey Rebellion, showed the intentions of the founders with regard to militias, rebellions, and the bearing of arms. One video will be dedicated to showing how licensing owners and registering guns will cut off criminals' easy access to guns. But this video is intended to summarize the main point, which is this. The argument that the Founding Fathers wanted militias to be private, anonymous, terrorist organizations intended to overthrow the government is, to borrow a quote, one of the most detestable of mankind, as the greatest misfortune our country has ever experienced. It is grotesque. The idea that the founders designed the Second Amendment to encourage and enable the very treason they defined as a high crime in the Constitution is tommyrot. The idea that shall not be infringed somehow nullifies all the restrictions that the Constitution put on militias is fetid cheese. The idea that shall not be infringed somehow intended for Billy Bob Hayseed to anonymously stockpile unregistered weapons and prepare to commit treason is malodorous milk. The founders saw the militia as a supplement to their standing army, subservient to the government, operating under their commander-in-chief, the president, registered with the government for training and to be activated when needed, with the goal of providing security to the state. The founders did not intend for the Second Amendment to be a self-destruct clause. The founders did not intend for the Second Amendment to be a suicide clause. Treason is not the reason for the Second Amendment. Treason is not the reason for the season.